My name is Kandy Crosby-Hastings. This is a video discussion board for the class U.S. History 530 for Liberty University. According to author George R. Beyer in the article Pennsylvania Germans Moved to Kansas, German settlers settled in Pennsylvania and Maryland as early as 1729. They next migrated to Virginia and North and South Carolina, and by the early 1800s they were settled in Illinois. After the Civil War, they migrated to Kansas, which is my home state. In fact, as an interesting side note, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was a descendant of these Pennsylvania German settlers. Eisenhower was, of course, born in Abilene, Kansas, which is about 26 miles from where I live. In fact, his boyhood home is maybe 200 or 300 yards from where we are filming this video in a replica of a frontier church. According to the information presented by the Dickinson County Heritage Center in Abilene, Pennsylvania German settlers, the Christians, known as the River Brethren, settled in Dickinson County in 1877. Based on the book, Plain Women, Gender and Ritual in the Old Order River Brethren by Margaret Reynolds and Simon Bronner, the River Brethren were founded by Jacob Engel sometime between 1770 and 1784. Donald F. Durbaugh, in the article Pennsylvania's Crazy Quilt of German Religious Groups, it tells us that the River Brethren were a revivalist or Methodist group. Their predecessors, the Brethren, who were nicknamed the Dunkers because of their style of baptism, were established by Alexander Mack in 1708, and they were what was considered a plain group or a pious group. These brethren focused on everyday rites, 4 rites in particular, and those were baptism, courtship, marriage, and burial. They conducted their church services in a High German style and only used English to communicate with the outside world. In fact, I found a very interesting newspaper article from Hagerstown, Maryland, dated July 26th of 1899. It ran the next day in the Washington Post, and it shows that the River Brethren, like their predecessors, held to an often controversial viewpoint of separation. Let me read that, please. The conservative River Brethren Church in Franklin County has declared war on seceders from that denomination who came to Cumberland Valley a few months ago from Kansas and who are known as the firebrands. The charge made by the River Brethren is that the seceders annoy and molest them at their meetings by denouncing them and their doctrines in their public gatherings. When expostulated with, the seceders have calmly told the Reverend Brother that they were going to perdition. The conservative churchmen threatened to prosecute their persecutors through a second party, as they never go to the law themselves. Reynolds and Bronner, who I'll be referring to their research throughout the rest of this presentation, write that the River Brethren were forbidden from taking oaths or from taking police action. They also state that Engel, the father of the River Brethren, borrowed from Methodist traditions, which is, we look here, from the signage from the Heritage Center, it does mention the influence of the Methodist circuit riders. He also borrowed from another German sect, the Mennonites, and from the Dunkers to form this new conglomeration of the River Brethren. From the older Brethren, Engels did keep certain traditions that included baptism by immersion, that included men wearing beards, election of leaders instead of casting lots, and foot washing. One of the most interesting traditions of the older Brethren that occurred was what they considered a love fest communion. It began the day on Saturdays with women fulfilling their sacred duty of bread making. The afternoon had sermons dealing with the suffering of Christ, and then that evening they would all gather to eat the bread and to wash the feet of their neighbors in Christian charity. It is important to note one important doctrinal difference between the Brethren and the River Brethren. The Brethren believed that baptism was necessary for salvation, a physical washing away of the sins and regeneration, whereas the River Brethren looked at baptism as an act of obedience after the new birth experience. Notice that Methodist influence there. To end, I would like to look for a moment at some photos that my son Taliesin and I recently took at the Dickinson County Heritage Center Museum. And notice the plain and simple clothing, the conservative style of dress for the women, when compared with the silver communion vessels. To me, this is a good illustration of the viewpoint of separation and devotion to God. Now, just so you know, today's Brethren churches include the Church of the Brethren and Brethren in Christ.